So we were just chatting before we hit record about how judgment and mercy has kind of been the backstory for you and where the Lord has taken you and how he's expanded your mindset maybe. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like what was going on in your heart early on?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm 52 years old. So I look back and I've loved Jesus my whole life. I have memories, I have first grade memories and second grade memories of memorizing chapters of the Bible. Like I have consumed my Bible for a long time and loved everything that came with church culture. I loved every time we could be together with our church family, just a deep love of that community. And I was blind to some of the ways in which I was creating in my mind narratives about the way that people should be or not be. And it was evolving into judgment. But anyway, when I was a missionary, somebody passed along to us a Bible study called The Gospel Transformation. It now has another title, but it was written by, which is an organization that has nothing to do with ours. And the tagline said something like, helping our people find their spiritual Achilles heel before the devil shows it to them. And it was about, it was encouraging small groups of people, at that point, people in full-time ministry, to sit around in circles in what we might call today a confessional community. And one of the exercises, there was a Bible study where you filled in the blank and you looked at Bible verses, but one of the exercises you had to do every week was to confess the sins to one another that nobody sees. So things that just happen in your mind. And people were confessing anxiety and fear and lust and envy and all the things you can't see. We can put our best foot forward in front of people. And what was probably very obvious to everyone around me, but was new information to me about me, is I confessed some sins of judgment. And as it came out of my mouth, sin sounds really ugly when you have to say it out loud. And I realized, wow, that really was impacting the way I was seeing someone. That really was impacting the way I was interacting with them. That really was impacting my willingness to engage with someone. The next week I came back, confessed more, like it was like uncovering more judgment. We were in that confessional community for about a year, and I have testimonies of people, because I was a missionary living out of the country. I would go long periods of time without maybe seeing my friends. And in the aftermath of that year, I had friends who would say to me, something about you has changed.
Really?
And it literally broke the back of that sin in my life. And that doesn't mean I can't still sometimes fall into those patterns, but man alive, it's a fraction of what it used to be. It had a stronghold in my life and I didn't even know it. I mean, obviously other people knew it about me, but I didn't know it about me. Sometimes I've almost overcorrected, and I have to be careful in that area now too. But yeah, there was so much freedom in not needing to be responsible for other people's behavior.
Well, can you give us an example of what that looked like? Like, what did it look like for you to form these judgments that were wrong? Because I think there is a difference between exercising good judgment and judging other people. Like the Bible does tell us, that's what I'm grappling with as I write this book. Like, it's not like get rid of all of the lines between right and wrong. Like, that's not really what God's asking of us. But yet, how did that work in your heart? Where did you cross the line into judgment?
I personally think that judgment and pride are first cousins, or at least they were in my mind. And so,
can I just interject there? Because we cannot express contempt. Judgment and contempt, they're maybe two sides of the same coin, but we can't express that without also saying something about ourselves, because when we're expressing contempt, it always is downward lifting. We're saying two things at once. We're saying, I would never do this, and you have, right? And so pride and judgment are first cousins. So, and then go ahead.
They were first cousins for me, because every time I was judging, and it wasn't like I would even do it consciously, I just kind of subtly would evaluate myself compared to other people. I mean, again, it sounds real ugly when it comes out of your mouth. When it was a behavioral pattern, I didn't know any different. I just would think all the things, about, and sometimes I found myself lacking. It wasn't like I was always better. Pride does not always mean you think you're better. It just means you're thinking about yourself, So I was comparing myself to other people in all the places and ways that women tend to do so. And if I felt someone was lacking, there's the judgment, then I felt a little bit better about myself. And what I can testify to is the absence of that behavior, the absence of that practice and pattern. Oh gosh, I actually feel so much lighter, and my relationship with the Lord is so much more intimate because I had a report card going on, and I was always grading myself, and I didn't even know I don't have the temperament of a perfectionist. That's not one of my struggles. So it wasn't like I needed to be perfect. I just thought there was a right way to live and a wrong way to live, and the way that I thought was the right way. And I didn't realize. So I think, to answer your question about the grappling you're doing today, I try to channel any of that energy into discernment. Like, will I take counsel from this person, or will I allow myself to be associated or influenced by this person, or will I? But I don't allow judgment any longer to influence relationship. I don't allow it to influence connection. I mean, that whole gospel transformation community and small group was happening, which is so funny because that's been now almost 15 years. And I've continued to be in relationship with those women. And we talk about how nobody really remembers anybody else's sins, but we all remember what the Lord did in our own life. And you get afraid to confess because you think, oh my gosh, once I say it, they'll always know this about me. Well, no, actually we don't care as much as we think. But that was all happening. And I was a foster parent to teenage girls. And because I was grading myself in that season, I thought I was a pretty good one. I had some really beautiful testimonies come out of that ministry. And of course I knew how to say that Jesus gets all the credit and he does the transformation and it was the Holy Spirit. But I still thought to myself, I'm a pretty key player in this. And then I got a very, very difficult child. And she was, at that point, we had 9 children under the roof. And she was more work than the other 8 combined. And she entered my home at age 12. And the story I'm going to tell you happened when she was 15. So we had been working really hard for 3 years in this relatively contentious environment. She brought tension into every room she walked into. And so we all just tried to overpower her. By the time she was 15, I had tried to kind of wrap myself around her so that if her bomb went off, I was the only one that felt the blast radius, that it wouldn't impact the rest of the kids. It was a complicated relationship I was having with her at that point. And we were having fights about everything: cell phone, boys, chores, curfew, homework. And when you're an adult and you are fighting with a 15-year-old, as if you are also 15 years old, it is time to cry out for help. And that is exactly what I did. And I asked this psychologist, Dr. Kyle Miller out of Texas, I asked him for help. And I said, come to my house and watch us for a few days. And ask me any question, challenge me in any area. I want to grow. What I'm doing isn't working, and this is all I know how to do. Like, if I need a new skill, develop me. So he watched for a couple of days, wrote a bunch of stuff down in his notebook I never saw. The last day, she walked out of her bedroom, and she had a pretty rocking 15-year-old body, and she had on a miniskirt she couldn't wear to school. And I said, you cannot wear that to school. You need to go change. So she goes into her room and she comes out in a pair of jeans and the tiniest tank top you've ever seen. I'm like, you cannot go to school in that. So she goes back in her room. Anyways, this happens a few times. Finally, she comes out in what she wanted to wear, or what she thought I wanted her to wear. And I said, you look great. She left my house. She went out the door, and I looked at Kyle and I said, she won, and she knows she won, because underneath that is exactly what she'd like to wear. And as soon as she gets around the corner, she's ripping off that top layer and going to school how she'd like to. And what's worse is she knows that I know that she won. And this is what she's so happy about right now. And I was acting like a 15-year-old. And he sat down and he drew me a picture of a tree. And the tree had three parts. It had some foliage. And on that foliage, he wrote the word attitude and actions. And then he drew a trunk and he just wrote the word self-image. And then he drew some roots down there and he wrote God's truth. And he said, Beth, I've been listening to you for 3 days. And like at least 90% of the airtime is taken up with your addressing her attitude and actions. And he just started to recount things that he had written down: curfew, boys, chores, facial expressions, all the things. And he said, you know what happens every time you try to correct her in one of those areas, you're like cutting off one of those limbs. And if you know anything about horticulture, when you cut off one of those limbs, it grows back twice as strong.
Wow.
And I said, can I get a witness? Yes. And he said, that little girl did not walk out of here in a miniskirt to offend you. And in fact, it probably had nothing to do with you. She walked out of here in a miniskirt because that's what her self-image is tied to. And he put his hand down on that trunk and he said, somebody told her that's where her worth is. And so her attitude and actions are coming out of her understanding of who she is. And her understanding of who she is comes directly from this garden. And inside of this garden, I know you've tried to put some things in there that are true, that God tells us, but she also has lies in the garden of her heart. And what do you think those lies sound like? And where do you think they came from? And as he and I had this conversation about the garden section of her life, I felt things like compassion and empathy and mercy and tenderness and even motivation at a time when that relationship was pretty broken. And he said, I have a prescription for you. How about for the next 90 days, unless she's going to hurt herself or somebody else, you don't address any of her attitude and actions. You just talk to her only about things that you know for sure. And I said, like nothing, like nothing about her cell phone or sneaking in or boys or curfew or placing your dishes. And he's like, well, you just tell me how that's been going for you. I'm like, not very well. And my gosh, I mean, Shannon, at this point in my life, I was a professional Christian. I mean, I was a missionary. I was an author. I was a Bible teacher. I knew my Bible. I would have to go in the morning and say to my Bible, like, give me something I can say to her. Nothing was coming to my mind. I bit my tongue so hard it practically bled sometimes. She would come home from school and say, well, that next week she came home to tell me how lame our spring break plans were. I wanted to defend myself and say, well, you know what? You're a ward of the state. And the whole reason we're not going anywhere for spring break is because I can't leave with you. But that would have made her feel shame. So I just said, you know what? Next week's going to be great, full of a hope and a future. And I knew I was quoting the prophet Jeremiah, but I didn't tell her that. She came home one day with this enormous homework assignment, like the kind that people have been working on for months, and it was due the next day, and she hadn't even started. And everything in me was like, how long have you known about this? But that would have taken us into a dark place. And I was like, Lord, what can I say to her that is true? And this isn't even an appropriate application of this verse, but I said, you know what? He's before all things, and in him all things will hold together. Let's get started. And what I can tell you is that over time, the Bible tells us that it's sweet to the taste like honey. And over time, what happened as I made sure that my mouth was full of true things, I found she walked into the room and was attracted to me, where at this point we had almost years of her walking into the room and being. And the only thing that changed was what came out of our mouth. And so anyway, this is not a formula, and it does not always happen this way. But in her case, like day 89, she prayed to receive Jesus. And I think she probably had been wanting to do that for a while. And I think I was the person to do that with her. But I wasn't talking to her about any of those kinds of things. I had been so busy talking to her about all the other stuff. We didn't really have a tenderness established to have that kind of conversation. And it wasn't like all of a sudden all her skirts got longer. I mean, we still had all the discussions after that, but things changed. She was my sister in Christ now. And so as I was learning all this through gospel transformation, and I was recognizing my own weaknesses, and I was watching what happens when I don't focus so much on people's attitude and actions, but I think more about what drove that behavior. What was the meaning behind that behavior?
Wow, girl, that's amazing. All of those things. I love this picture. And I feel like, okay, I just read a book called Gospel Fluency,
Okay.
and he used an image of a tree that was really similar. I really like that,
Hmm.
where we're addressing, like, because we can't share the gospel and talk about the fruit. We got to talk about the roots, right? And so, how can we turn conversation where we would naturally go to judging one another, judging behavior, whether it's parenting or even in our minds when we're thinking about other people? I love this idea of going to those roots.
Yes, because I have, and this, the way that it has now equipped me, 15 years later, is that when anyone, especially in the intimacy of my household, I mean, this is true whether we're talking about my neighbor or someone I read about online, but if I think about my most important relationships, if someone in my world is saying something, doing something I don't like, I have to ask myself, I could just try to match that energy and cut off that branch or reject that branch. Or I could do a little bit of work and figure out where did that come from? What is it about you I can understand? And that process will always create connection. And if I have any desire to influence them, it's going to happen over connection. There is no influence that happens through judgment. I mean, in fact, that's a disconnector. And so it's really to my benefit to try to be as curious as possible about why people think or behave or say how they do. That's the talk about fluency. That's how we're going to make conversation and